Hello, so today we are going to discuss youth homelessness and the juvenile justice system. Now, in this idea and topic of youth homelessness and the juvenile justice system comes the real discussion of the subtopic of homeless youth surviving the streets. So, this is the first bullet point here is homeless youth surviving the streets. Then underneath there's 3 different articles that give ideas and ways that homeless youth survive the streets and different things that people can do to make a difference. Now, our first article, the second bullet point, is more than just a seat at the table. The power of youth voice in ending youth homelessness across the United States. Now, this particular article focused on the idea of ending youth homelessness and how and what they can do to end youth homelessness, but it specifically was placed in Texas, done in Texas, the research. But these kids are speaking out on behalf of all youth homelessness surviving the streets across the United States, not just in Texas. Then we have our second article, which is explaining homeless youth criminal justice interactions, childhood trauma, or surviving life on the streets. This article went a little more in depth about homeless youth surviving the streets, and it found more about the negative impacts that homeless youth surviving the streets can have on a homeless youth surviving the street, as well as the risk factors that homeless youth surviving the streets face every day. Because they do face a lot of them, and not many people know about them. And our third and final article here is youth homelessness and vulnerability. How does couch surfing fit? So this article specifically focused on couch surfing and what couch surfing is and the impact couch surfing can have on the homeless youth themselves, the friends, the family, all of that. Now we're going to move on to our next slide. Our next slide is the goals and the objectives of homeless youth surviving the streets. Like, what can we do to make a change? So, our first goal here is to bring more attention to the topic of homeless youth surviving the street. There's not enough attention on it, so there needs to be brought more. Also, changes need to be made. And by bringing more attention, you can have changes. You can have these changes that are made that happen to help homeless youth survive the streets. As mentioned before, specifically Texas is speaking out on behalf of the homeless youth across the United States, and there's as a whole. It's not just Texas speaking out for Texas, it's Texas speaking out for all homeless youth surviving the streets across the United States as a whole. And they're using their voice to advocate. Also, attention to risk factors need to be brought into light a little more because homeless youth face them every day. And as I mentioned before, not many people know about these risk factors that they can face. They might just think, oh, it's the weather, and it's more than that. Also, now falling under these risk factors, we have being arrested is one of the biggest risk factors, which also ties into the next point underneath it, which is the juvenile justice system. So when you're arrested as a homeless youth, you could be placed in the juvenile justice system. So those are big risk factors for homeless youth, just being put into the juvenile justice system without being heard out. Also, the trauma. Now, this trauma could stem from being a homeless youth, before being a homeless youth, after being a homeless youth. Like, the trauma it's a lifelong impact as well. So, like, the impact and experiences, like, the trauma can interconnect with that, and it could impact somebody's life forever, either negatively or positively. depending on how it goes. Mostly negatively, though, from the research that has been done. Also, the impacts and experiences, learning about these impacts that the homeless youth face and the experiences that they go through to survive on the streets allows for advocates and anyone else who wants to advocate to be able to advocate for the homeless youth surviving the streets. Now we're going to move on to the next slide. Our next slide is the definition of important terms. The first bullet point is advocate. So to advocate is to support a cause, and you push to help those people in the cause. Like, you push for better, you push for changes for them. You do what you can to help them. You're advocating for them. Our second bullet point is risk factors. The risk factor is something that a homeless youth surviving the streets could face every day, whether that is being arrested or something as small as the weather, like it's raining. So it's just a risk factor that a homeless youth faces every day, and it potentially could put them in danger. It doesn't always, but it potentially could put them in danger. And our last term here, last important term, is couch surfing. So couch surfing is when someone goes from couch to couch of either their friends, their families, maybe strangers, shelters, wherever, and it's a different couch almost every night. It's usually a different couch. So if you stay at your one friend's one night, then the next night you stay maybe at your other friend's. It's not consistently staying at someone's house for like a week or so. Here's our next one. And why is this important? Why is this topic important? The idea of homeless youth surviving the streets. This is important because it's been a pressing issue for many years, and people have been trying to make changes. There's many programs out there to help make changes. As we will see in the next slide, there's many programs, many different ways that people can help make changes. And by bringing this idea and this topic to light of homeless youth surviving the streets, it gets more attention, which allows, if there's more attention, you can make differences and changes into helping and advocating for these homeless youth surviving the streets. And one example of helping and advocating for homeless youth surviving the streets goes back to the article about the Texas youth using their voice. So they're one way that they're advocating, and they're an example of advocating for those homeless youth who are surviving the streets. There are also lifelong negative impacts that could be put on or interpreted, received by a homeless youth surviving the streets. This stems from the risks, such as being arrested, such as the childhood trauma. Even if you're a homeless youth as a kid and then say you go into somewhere good and then you grow up and then you have this great life, you could still stem back to your childhood where you were a homeless youth trying to survive on the streets. So that would be an example of a lifelong negative impact that surviving the streets would have on a homeless youth. There are also many ways to help, and there are many recommendations that people can use, and even homeless youth can look at them and be like, okay, I can go to this program and get help from these people. So they definitely have those out there. There are six specific recommendations for programs that could help homeless youth, or even anyone who just wants to help homeless youth. So our first one is to obtain the clarity of purpose. Our second one is to provide training, which could be job training, school training, anything like that. Then you can hire a facilitator to help the homeless youth get back on track. Then you can formalize youth roles and be like, yes, you're a youth, like you're important, like this is what you should do, like do this, I'll help you, get help with that. And you can be consistent. Being consistent is very important and very good, and especially being flexible. I mean, just in life, just being flexible is very important. And if you're consistent and flexible, you can really help someone out. Okay, next slide. So this is what is being done. So what is being done for the homeless youth trying to survive the streets? So we have the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This particular program, they strive for a better future for homeless youth surviving the streets, as well as helping with housing and making sure that everyone has an equal way of housing, of being placed into a house. That you're not just thrown into a house, that you're in this house, like everyone's equal across the board. Then we have the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program. This program allows to strive for a better future. They're pushing for the better future. They're pushing for it. And they also help with housing, and they allow homeless youth to come to them and ask for assistance, and they will help the homeless youth surviving the streets with housing, whether it's just permanent, temporary, whatever it is, if they're like going from one house to another, or they have to move around a little bit, but they do help and they try to push for that particular thing, and they emphasize prevention. We also have the federal agency methods, which are helpful to those homeless youth living on the streets. There's their different organizations, which could be the two listed above. They're through the government, like you can go to them and they'll help you. There are different shelters around, wherever. Then we also, having knowledge about the risk factors is very important, especially if you're advocating and trying to help homeless youth, so you can help them try to avoid or steer away from a possible risk factor. And that's also ties in with the lifelong impacts, because if you have knowledge of the lifelong impacts that this one particular homeless youth dealt with and you're helping them, then you know, okay, like this is their situation, this is what they've gone through, this is how they've been impacted, what can I do to really help them and not help them forget, but just help them get a better future. And then also we have the recommendations, and just using these recommendations, going to these places, any way that you can advocate and help, just guiding along the way if you have to, is a good way to help homeless youth surviving the streets by using the recommendations. And just being educated on the topic of homeless youth surviving the streets, and just using that knowledge and sharing that knowledge out, and just letting others know, like, this is an important topic. Like, this is important. And we just have some additional info and a closing. So the additional info is just, if you're reading these articles or any other articles about this topic or the subtopic or any other subtopic that may be underneath, using that knowledge and those resources and recommendations is really good, and like use them to help make a change, make a difference. If you get more attention to this topic, you can get more change done as well. And as we can see, Texas is speaking out. Other states as well are probably speaking out. As they're speaking out, they're using their voices and they're advocating across the United States and assist all across the United States. It doesn't just have to be the state that you're in. Also, being the risk factors, just knowing the risk factors, knowing possible risk factors, even if this one person, for example, didn't go through the risk factors, but it is a possibility. And just being educated is super important. And just advocating, just keep advocating and pushing for homeless youth surviving the streets. Thank you.